Are you retiring in the next 10, 20, maybe 30 years? At some point, you hope, right? Well, what if I tell you that Social Security will probably mess up your retirement plans? See, the US government is racking up loans faster than teenagers with their parents' credit cards, okay? And if nothing changes, it's going to drive the US into a $175 trillion debt crisis. Yes, trillion with a capital frickin' D. I'll let you know how I'm preparing, so stick around until the end. Now, with $175 million, this is a hard number to imagine, okay? After all, it's about 7 times the United States' current $25 trillion GDP and almost double the world's $100 trillion annual GDP. Now, to wrap our heads around this, let's look at history. The U.S. has been borrowing money since the day of its inception. Debts incurred during the American Revolutionary War totaled $75 million, most of which were loans from domestic investors and the French government for war materials. War, debt, and money printing always goes together, doesn't it? But anyway, that's a rabbit hole for another day. From the start, the government needed loans to plug in budget deficits. Unfortunately, nothing has really changed since the good old days, okay? Over the centuries, the debt has grown due to a variety of different factors. All those regime change wars cost trillions of dollars. Economic crises print a few trillion. What's the harm? What could happen, right? Worst possible scenario. Significant policy decisions, Green New Deal, whatever it might be. Money, print, borrow, more debt. The numbers increased exponentially during the American Civil War back in the day. It reached $1 billion in 1863. It quickly became almost $3 billion when the war ended in 1865. It then grew steadily into the 20th century. It was about $22 billion after the country financed its involvement in the First World War. In more recent times, of course, the U.S. government had to resort to borrowing due to the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the 2008 financial crisis, the Corona beer pandemic. All of these things cost a lot of money. From 2019 to 2021, spending increased by 50%, mostly due to the pandemic. It has grown so big that the U.S. now has about $35 trillion in debt, an unbelievable, unpayable sum of money. And that number is increasing by about $1 trillion every 100 days, or $3.6 trillion a year. No one's steering the ship. It's insane. You know what's even crazier? The debt is so big that the interest payment in 2023 exceeded $1 trillion. FYI, that's bigger than the GDPs of smaller countries like Switzerland and Singapore. And the interest payment alone is set to surpass defense spending by some metrics it already has. The question is if the U.S. can service this debt. Yeah. Anyway, there's a term called debt to GDP ratio. It's a measure that compares a country's total debt to its gross domestic product. Think of it like comparing your credit card debt to your yearly salary. It shows how much a country owes compared to what it makes in a year. A higher ratio means more debt relative to income, which can be a sign of financial stress. So right now, the USA has $35 trillion in debt and a $25 trillion GDP, which puts the debt to GDP ratio at more than 120%. It's like charging $50,000 on your credit card while you only earn $40,000 a year, which is pretty crazy. But it gets even loonier. You see, the debt to GDP ratio during the 2008 financial crisis was only 68%. So that means the USA is borrowing more and more when compared to its income. Now, to be fair, other countries like Japan, like Italy, also have high debt to GDP ratios. In fact, higher. However, if left unchecked for too long, it can become catastrophic. For example, Venezuela has one of the highest debt to GDP ratios in the world. And I know we can't compare the USA to Venezuela. Okay, guys, but just for reference, all right? Now, the high debt level combined with political instability, I feel like that's been happening in America recently, has led to hyperinflation and economic contraction. Crazy stuff. Now, this is a much deeper topic. We're going to dive into some really sticky details here in a second, but I want to take a quick second to let you know about the Wealth Mastery newsletter. This is your weekly guide to the cryptocurrency markets. Our readers love it. I'm sure you will too. And here's why. Because every week, my team of researchers and I, we help you not just to stay ahead of the curve, but also to save your time by finding you the latest and greatest insights on all the things happening in crypto, altcoins, meme coins, DeFi, airdrops, charts, and much, much more. You can join our 135,000 plus weekly readers for free. Link in the description or the pinned comment over on X. Thank you very much. Now, I know after hearing all this stuff, you might have some questions. Why the heck is the US government overspending anyway? Can't it just cut its spending? Oh, no. It's possible, but it's complicated, okay? There's lots of wars and stuff to fund, okay? Come on. Those wars aren't going to fund themselves, guys. And defense contractors, think about the poor defense contractors. Anyway, for example, there are times when it has to be done, okay? In an actual wartime scenario, you can't just say, well, I'm being frugal, so let's call a truce. Elective wars, different conversation, but beyond scope of this video. Anyway, we have to remember that the government needs a lot of money to keep everything working, okay? The machinery of government, the collecting of taxes, all that stuff. And unfortunately, taxes are not enough. Now, besides this debt, it can be sort of beneficial, at least for the government, not for you, but for the government. You see, this little thing called inflation makes it easier for them. Think of debt as any asset that loses its value over time. For example, if you take a $500,000 loan with a fixed 7% interest rate, you'd have to pay about $3,300 monthly. Now, it might sound like a lot, but because of inflation, chances are your income will also increase, and the $3,300, which is a fixed price, fixed mortgage, won't sound too bad as time goes by. The government kind of tries to apply the same logic here. Now, we discussed this before, and if you want to know more, I'll leave a link below. So how does this affect you? Well, you might say, it's the government's problem. I want nothing to do with it. Oh, the government's problems, they have a way of making them your problems. Whether you like it or not, it's probably going to affect you in one way or another. For one, if you think the U.S. government will take care of you if you're living in the U.S., they're probably not going to. You probably want to have a plan B, okay? Don't rely on the government to take care of you guys, because they're probably not going to, regardless of what country you live in. Now, a U.S. Treasury financial report actually reveals an alarming $175 trillion gap in Social Security and Medicare funding. And if you do the math, that's more than $1.3 million per U.S. household. I doubt if the average household is, I know they're not even close to that number, okay? Now, for clarification, the $175 trillion is separate from the deficits and the $35 trillion national debt. It's just a lot, giant numbers everywhere. It's crazy. Going back, the Treasury report says that the U.S. will spend $215.7 trillion in the next 75 years to give Social Security and Medicare payouts to beneficiaries. Everyone's just living longer. Everyone's just living longer. It's a problem for the governments, right? You're probably gonna have to keep working later. It's gonna be a real mess. Anyway, during that time, the government's expected to collect only $137.4 trillion, primarily from payroll taxes. This leaves a $78.3 trillion funding gap. What? Which, according to the report, can only be addressed through increased borrowing, higher taxes, reduced benefits, or some combination of these. And of course, America always seems to have a new war with somebody. That's going to add more trillions, right? All options are politically unpalatable. Maybe that is the reason why those in power simply try to keep ignoring it and kicking the can down the road for as long as they can. Okay, Lark, but you said the gap's only $175 trillion. The math only shows $78.3 trillion deficit. The $175 trillion figure comes from looking even further in the future and includes not just the next 75 years, but really all future obligations. This model accounts for the entire lifetime of current and future participants. Current participants are expected to use $105.4 trillion more than they contribute, and future participants, those under 15 or not yet born, will use $69.9 trillion more than they contribute. Adding these together gives the total of $175.3 trillion funding gap. In simpler terms, future retirees are going to get screwed unless the government gets its act together. Don't go holding your breath on that one, guys. However, the future does not look very bright. How long do you think the government keep up this charade of massive spending, massive debt, huge deficits? At some point, the piper will have to be paid. The U.S. is maxing out its credit card on top of taking out a second mortgage and then YOLO longing meme coins, essentially. Even creditors know this. Holders of U.S. debt like China are dumping U.S. treasuries. Would you give a loan to somebody who may not be able to pay his debt? Probably not. Now add the $175 trillion gap in Social Security, Medicare funding, plus $35 trillion in debt, which is currently increasing by $1 trillion every 3 months, $3.6 trillion a year, and you have a debt time bomb that could blow up at any time with catastrophic effects for everybody around the world. That's because the size of the U.S. economy is monstrous, and its impact globally is monstrous, and it will affect everybody, okay? U.S. resident or not. So are we just going to wait for all this to blow up on our faces? I wish there was some magic bullet for this, but honestly, the best way is to save yourself, okay? And that might be a bit of diversification. Obviously, not financial advice. Don't get me wrong. I want the U.S. to survive this. I want them to fix their problem. I don't want anybody to have to suffer through what could be coming. But just in case, limiting your exposure to the dollar could not be the worst idea in the world. Doesn't make sense to have the majority of your wealth sitting in fiat currency anyway. Remember Michael Saylor, we call those people poor. Now, that might face problems in the future. But right now, okay. Now, besides fiat loses value over time, investing in gold has always been a hedge against uncertainty. Countries are now hoarding it globally. Maybe it's time to copy what those central banks are doing. I'm also looking to diversify into other things, property, ETFs, dividend stocks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Worst case scenario, Maybe you want to have a farm. I don't know. Things that really apocalyptic. Historically speaking, during economic turmoils, the best stocks to hold, of course, consumer staples, utilities, healthcare, stuff that doesn't go away and is always needed. Tech stocks will do bad. Most of all, the ultimate plan B, Bitcoin. It's a rare deflationary asset class that cannot be controlled by anybody and definitely is made for times of global uncertainty. No retirement portfolio, in my opinion, can be complete without it. Now, if governments, billionaires, asset managers like BlackRock have it and think it's great, maybe it's time you do too. I don't know. Just follow the money, guys. Follow the money. And a lot of roads lead back to Bitcoin. Thanks for watching.